Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be delving into an interesting topic, which is how to create the perfect spell in Call of Cthulhu. Or really, more specifically, what makes a good spell in Call of Cthulhu? What goes into crafting your own spells, and how should you go about using the spells that come with, say, the Grand Grimoire of Cthulhu Mythos magic? And today we are going to be looking into what makes a good Call of Cthulhu spell specifically. This does not apply to spells in Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that. This is for a horror game, any horror game really, but as you can see by the description, it's mostly Call of Cthulhu. So first off, there is a huge difference between magic in most other systems and magic in Call of Cthulhu. In most other systems, magic is a tool to be utilized. In Call of Cthulhu, it's a plot device and a lot of times a detrimental one. Not to the story, but to the players. So when you go to create a spell in Call of Cthulhu, you need to make sure that you are putting a very high level of risk into the spell. And obviously you could make some shortcuts for the cultists and other ne'er-do-wells who might be using the spell, but for players specifically, it should be very, very, very. You also should not really let them know how bad the spell actually is, and that is almost true for every spell you can find in the Grand Grimoire of Cthulhu Mythos magic. It costs sanity, magic points, a bunch of different resources are drained. Sometimes permanently. It takes a lot of time to cast, needs different components, and then you, as the player, often do not really know exactly what it's going to do, and sometimes it will have side effects or send you into madness. And then if you just look in the Call of Cthulhu Keeper's rulebook, you'll see how vastly difficult it is to even cast a spell. So spells in Call of Cthulhu are not at all utility. They are not made for the players to have a perpetual source of attack. Most spells in Call of Cthulhu I would not recommend using more than once. There might be a couple exceptions. There's a few different exceptions to that. But in general, the spells in Call of Cthulhu they don't have a one line of description like Dungeons and Dragons. They have so many different ways you can interpret them as the keeper. So in one game let's see, what do we got? Bliss. Here's a spell called Bliss. This spell permits the caster to escape to a mental refuge to protect them from what would normally cause sanity loss. It costs 3 magic points for each minute of bliss and 1 sanity point per casting. The drawback is that the spell's target is unable to move or defend themselves physically for the duration of the spell. Now, you read that, right? Now, first of all, you can see exactly what I mean. This is actually a perfect example. It costs 3 magic points or more, at least. So 3 magic points for each minute it's kept. And 1 sanity point. So to block the sanity, you still have to lose at least 1 point of sanity. It is cast immediately, so that's one good thing. But then you see how it has a catch. You can't move or defend yourself physically for the duration of the spell. And there are a lot of situations where you would rather take the sanity damage than be crushed or ripped to shreds or just flattened. I don't know. So, because of that, to protect them from what would normally cause sanity loss, seeing a mythos monster, prolonged torture, etc. See, this is a perfect example because it's a spell that has a little bit of utility use. It does not really give you an exact way of describing the spell. And I could think of a few different ways. So you could describe it as the keeper, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because every one of the spells that you create should have multiple different interpretations. Every spell in the book all have different interpretations so that you can keep things interesting. You don't want Fireball. Fireball's so... Like, you know, the iconic Dungeons and Dragons spell is literally a fireball. You shoot a ball of fire. It's very self-explanatory. The description is all in the name. If it was called Call Forth Fire, however, you see how many different iterations there are just from that? So, something to think about. So, for example, Bliss could create a blue glowing aura around the target. You could describe to the target how their mind suddenly feels awash in a blissful sensation of peace, even as something is hacking at their body, ripping limb from limb. They're still just at peace, and they're not taking sanity damage because they're in a state of nirvana almost. They're meditating. So now you've got a mental way of describing it, and you can describe it multiple different ways mentally. You could even describe it in a bad way, you know, like it says it costs a sanity point, so maybe suddenly there's a million whispers in their head, which distract them from whatever's going on, which causes 1 point of sanity damage and paralyzes them. But at least they're not paying attention to the much greater evil out there, right? Rather the evil you know, or rather the evil you create. I don't know. So yeah, that's one thing to look into when you go about creating a spell, is that it should have some drawbacks, it should have high risk, and it should have some form of reward, but really it's mostly a plot device. Which, as you know, is my motto for pretty much everything Call of Cthulhu related, is that the story comes first before everything else. I mean, I guess having fun or everyone enjoying the game comes first, story comes second, rules come dead last. So, yeah. Let's continue. So, next of all, you've got... Let's see. Deeper magic. And I personally love to make deeper magic options for any spells I create. And what's cool about Call of Cthulhu is that this spell book right here has a lot of vaguely described spells that have extremely specific effects. And what that helps you with is that there will always be room to make more. So you're able to interpret any of these however you want. They just all have very, very so specific effects that you can create more and more specific effects. You know what I mean? So, for example, let's see. Circle of Nausea. Creates a powerful protective circle around the caster that causes pain and nausea in any human approaching it. The caster must draw a chalk circle on the ground, then fortify the circle with 4 enchanted opal stones, one at each of the 4 points of the compass. Enchanting the stones requires magic points put into them. So you see how specific that is? It causes stomach aches to those who pass it. It's a circle. And then you can take that Circle of Nausea spell and change it into something else, a Circle of Burning. And now you've made your own spell. Anyone who passes the circle feels a burning sensation. Then you can make it even more specific. Specifically, deep ones that pass the circle feel a burning sensation, right? So keep in mind that there will always be room to create more spells, and that's as it should be, since spells are not for utility use, but should be unique to every story you create. Deep magic. So let me read this little thing on deep magic. Sanity points gauge a person's hold on reality, which is not reality at all, but only the consensual delusion that protects humanity from that which it cannot fully comprehend, in this game, the Cthulhu Mythos. The magic of the Cthulhu Mythos is corrosive to humanity. Through the acquisition of mythos knowledge and the casting of spells, a person's mind becomes shredded. His or her sanity eventually fades into oblivion until only the mythos and insanity remains. For the cultist or sorcerer, the ultimate goal is to supplant all traces of sanity with knowledge of the nature of the cosmos, or what they can perceive as the truth of existence. Achieving a paradigm shift, they are insane, yet are able to conceal their madness, and able to continue to pursue their personal agendas without overt hindrance from society at large. Before I continue, that right there is exactly what you need to... That is the driving idea behind every spell in Call of Cthulhu, is that while it might have some short-term benefits, in the long term, they're all bad. Magic is evil. Magic is wrong. Magic is corrosive to humanity and will break your mind. Magic is fundamentally unethical and unmoral and will destroy the person who's using it. Very interesting. So that is the fundamental building block in all Cthulhu Mythos magic. But let's continue, because deep magic is where you take a spell and you make it even more powerful but at a greater cost. And this book has some examples. So those who have taken that final step beyond insanity and have begun to reconcile the realities of Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, other forces of the mythos are able to elevate their understanding beyond what is possible within a rational human mind. Insane wizards at zero sanity may draw upon greater powers than the rest of humanity. They are liberated by their madness and empowered through mythos knowledge. These individuals then discover new facets within their spellcraft, gain access to deeper magic. This kind of experimentation is what takes up most of a true wizard's time and thought. So, the spells described in this book, and when you create spells, could feature notes concerning deeper magic. It could be enhancements of the spell's power or effects, variant forms, or information concerning hidden wisdom on ways to combat the spell. Let's see. These are just examples of possibilities available and are intended to supply keepers with inspiration, as with everything in this entire book. And some players might be able... investigators may, if it's the keeper's will, learn deeper levels of magical understanding. And they give some statistic ways for you to do this, and I would recommend sticking to this, because deep magic, once you learn how to cast it, is like permanent, I believe. Unless, of course, you made them forget it afterwards. So there are ways to work around this. But in general, when the person casts deep magic, they are consumed by it and they remember it. So what I want you to remember when you're creating deeper magic is that you should always have layers of magic. In deep magic, in this book, there's one layer. For my spells, I like there to be more than one layer. Have there be multiple different, like the roots of a tree branching out, and deeper and deeper and deeper you go until you get to ridiculous anomalies and monstrosities and atrocities and otherities. So, that being said, there is also the opposite of deep magic, which is flawed spells. And this is extremely, in my opinion, a flawed spell can be one of the greatest plot devices of all time, especially when the bad guys are using it. So, can cause environmental changes. It basically means if they've done something wrong in the details of a spell. If a player or a non-player character casts a spell, messes something up, the spell could not function at all. That's so boring. Spell does not function but causes environmental changes for 1d6 rounds. That's really good. And the suggested environmental changes are freak weather. Blood pours from the ground and begins to boil. Creatures from beyond can be seen swimming through the air. A great rent in the earth opens up. Spell functions but causes side effects. That's probably one of the best. Spell functions but causes additional effects. All those nearby suffer some form of damage. Spell functions in some other way entirely. Spell concerning a particular mythos entity or deity. The caster is transported to the location of the entity or deity. Now that will get the investigator killed. 10 times out of 10. You're immediately transported to Azathoth, into the fiery chaos, and they're gone. Roll a new character. I love that term. Let's roll a new character. That's, again, the metagaming mindset that I cannot stand. Let's roll a new character, as if rolling is how you make a character. But I digress. The caster is racked with searing pain and explodes in a towering column of purple flame. That's a good option. So anyway, just understand how no spell... I guess my point in saying all of this is to keep in mind when you're creating a spell that just like any other rules, they are not the end-all be-all. And there are deeper versions, then there are flawed versions. And then there can be variants, and then it can go deeper and deeper and deeper, or get more flawed and flawed and flawed as it goes on. Yeah, keeping that in mind, let's continue on to the next idea, which is sacrifice. Now, when most people think about sacrifice and magic, they think of killing people. They think of sacrificing on like an altar or something. But that's not necessarily what it has to always mean. And here's why I think sacrifice is such a useful component for this horror game for your spells, any spell that you make. And it doesn't have to be a living thing. But when an investigator has to sacrifice something beyond sanity points or magic points, it takes the spell's casting to a whole new level of tension, importance, plot significance, and is a real decision for the player. And that is one thing that you should do, is you should not ever, and this is general advice, but you should not present the player with where they either cast the spell or keep the object or item or person alive, where there is no option. Because that's where the greatest in-game moments for the players come, is when there is an option. You know, this evil creature is going to... let's think. So let's say throughout the course of a campaign, your investigator has gotten almost attached to someone who's almost the main villain of the campaign. He's a misguided, deluded person who eventually ends up summoning a creature from beyond. This creature goes to kill him. You, who are a devout student of the occult, and the book that this deluded person was using belongs to you and is super important to you. You know the one way to send the creature back to its plane of existence is to destroy the book. You also know that the creature won't be there long, and after killing the person who summoned it, will probably leave. Now there is a real decision, because your life isn't at stake, some random guy's life is at stake. Are you going to sacrifice the book that you spent years and years of your life searching for till you finally found it in a underground ruin where you were almost killed? Are you going to sacrifice that? All your knowledge? And that is a much better juxtaposition of choice, or some type of contrasting elements where they have a real choice. And that is a whole nother video, is the essence of choice. That's my next video. Thank you, Self, for coming up with that, or at least for giving you the idea for that. Anyway, let me continue. So yes, I think that sacrifice is a very important component to spells because they make them more meaningful. Next, I would definitely recommend getting this book. You don't need to, but if you're looking to make spells, there are some great resources in here in the very first 2 chapters, where you got a list of magical tools and spell components. Make use of these tables if you can get your hands on them. Maybe you can find them on the internet. I don't know. But they're very, very, very good. Then you can also look at, the different types of spell components. There's a bunch. Symbolic, comparative, non-physical, physical, verbal, somatic, and mental. Some of you who know Dungeons & Dragons will remember verbal, somatic, and stuff like that. But There's also some stuff on magical residue, but does not, and ley lines, but neither of these things have anything to do with what I'm trying to get across to you. Maybe we can cover that in another video. Yeah. There are different types of spells. The makers of Call of Cthulhu have put them into different categories. You have banishment or control, bringing forth monsters or gods, combat, communication, dreamlands. I cannot stand the dreamland spells, by the way. It's not that I can't stand them. I love the dreamland spells. And when the book tells me I can't use them outside of the dreamlands, I'm like, yeah, screw you. I'm just going to turn it down a notch, and we're still going to use this. Because a lot of the dreamland spells are actually the most creative in the entire book, and I think that they are very useful for confounding your players. So bear that in mind, that do not feel constrained. Enchantments, environmental spells, life extension spells, folk spells, which folk spells are not real. They're not real magic. They are diluted magic or actions and effects that might appear magical. Harmful, any harmful that's outside of combat. There are quite a few that curse the user, or not the user, the target. Influencing others, making monsters, other spells. There's a nice little catch-all. Attract fish. That's a good spell. Protection spells. Any spells related to time, transformation, travel and transportation, call, contact, and summon. Might have said call, contact, and summon already. That was disambiguation. Let me go over the final thing that I wanted to talk to you about was how statistically to go about coming up with a full spell. And what you do is you think about, what is the purpose of this spell within my game? What purpose does it serve? If you go to make a spell, make sure that you understand the implications of including the spell. Think about how your players might try to abuse the spell. Think about how the spell could be overpowered. And think about ways to make it not overpowered but still extremely interesting with your descriptions and the title. Then you look... Oh, before I continue, another thing about titles for spells. Never call it what it actually is. You'll see at the bottom you have alternative names. Always use an alternative name. Never call Summon Cthulhu, Summon Cthulhu. You know, you call it Summon the Watery Voice to the Deep or something like that. You know, like, do not let your players know ever exactly what it is they're doing unless they've done it before. So anyway, you look at any given spell and you see that you need a name. Now, the name, you want to have alternative names and a normal name, right? So the normal name kind of is a perfect title for exactly what the spell does, very utility title. Then you might want to come up with some alternative names. Here, Benevolent Influence has the alternative names Ritual of Authority, Aura of Control, and the Agreeable Tongue of Festus. That's one good way to make an alternative name, is to add a name to your name. Then you think about what type of cost this is going to, what is this going to cost players who cast it? And you come up with the cost, which can be magic points, sanity points, and can also be power. Obviously, anything else could be sacrificed as well, but those are the main things. Magic, sanity, and power. And some of the most interesting spells tie these losses into the spell's description or the text box. And I love it when it does that. So it'll say, here you have to carve out the eyes of the target. And it'll say, this is where you take the 5 sanity damage. Because that makes sense. That's a perfect point for you to take the sanity damage. And that's a better way than just saying, all right, you take this much of everything right at the beginning, and instead drawing the spell casting out into almost a full scene in itself, where different things happen at different times, you know? It's just a way to build tension, atmosphere, mood, and continue to bring the horror, amp up the horror. So anyway, I would highly recommend tying in the costs to the descriptions. Next, you look at the casting time. Now, I cannot stand casting times that are like multiple days or weeks. And I understand why some spells have them, but some have casting times that I do not agree with. I would increase the magic point or sanity point loss and decrease the casting time in quite a few different cases. Not all. Think about what you want the spell to do. But definitely a lot of times you should make sure that it does not take too long to cast. Then you want to come up with a text block. And again, if you've thought about how this spell is going to work its way into your story, it will be very easy to do so. However, if you haven't, you have to think about why this spell is in your game. You have to think about why the cult leader is going to be casting this. You want to know why it's in the book that the players are going to be getting. What plot purpose can it serve? And when you figure that out, the spell description is not going to be too hard. For an example, I can't really give that example. Let's just say in my self-published scenario on DriveThruRPG, I guess technically DriveThruRPG published the scenario, but in the scenario Raid of Area 51, which is on the Miskatonic repository, you can find a link to it in the description, although I'm releasing an updated version soon, so, aside from that, there is a spell, which I think in this book was called, Breath of the Watery Deep or something like that, and it basically made the player or the character choke on water. In that scenario, there is a emphasis on the drying up of water throughout the whole scenario, just like an image system almost. Something that I might make a video on that too. Something to add to your Dungeon Master or your Game Master toolbox, where you use the same thing multiple times to strengthen a theme. But anyway, so I took this spell and I changed it from making the character's lungs fill up with water to making their lungs fill up with salt. And first of all, that's a truly horrifying spell. That I feel like I unintentionally made way worse. It's kind of very disturbing to think about having all your lungs filled up with salt and choking and coughing up the chalky, and having all the moisture in your body being sucked out of you, kind of. It's crazy. But through that, I was able to tweak Breath of the Watery Deep or whatever and change it into the Breath of Morkothoth or whatever it was I called it, so that it worked well within my scenario that I made, and it served the plot and gave both the cultists something interesting to try to do to the investigators, and gave the investigators some pretty interesting weapon should they figure out how to use it. But I gave it a high cost so that if the investigators were able to use it, they'd only really be able to use it once or twice. Then you go about writing out exactly the text block's exact requirements. In there, you write down any other requirements that are not in the cost, such as you need to cut out the eyes of the victim, or you need a doll or a crystal ball or a hat, or I don't know. So, for example, Benevolent Influence. This arduous spell exacts many requirements from the caster. A regimen of meditation and breathing exercises. That already is a scene all by itself. Along with a strictly prescribed diet, which must be followed for 3 solar months before the spell may be attempted. That can actually drive some of the character's motivation, or at least some things that a character does throughout an entire scenario. When ready, the caster must fast for 3 days, then enact the ritual, which involves an hour of chanting, sacrifice of 10 magic points, and a successful hard power roll by the caster. If successful, the spell magnifies the willpower of the caster, making them more able to influence and manipulate people. For 1 solar month, the caster's appearance raises by 10, and a bonus die is granted to Charm, Fast Talk, Intimidate, and Persuade rolls, so all interpersonal skills. I think. Is that all of them? Yes. As long as the diet and meditations continue, the spell can be recast each month. So one thing to take into account from the stat block is that you want to add some flavor text, and you also want to put in any other statistical or game-related things, as they do with the hard power roll, and appearance rises by 10, and a bonus die is granted to these different rolls. And yeah, as long as you then have some alternative names and whatnot, you've got a spell. And hopefully this video helped you, and if let me know below in the comments section. Tell me what type of spells, like what are your favorite spells in Call of Cthulhu, and how do you think spells can be better used by keepers? Like, how do you think keepers could use spells better for plot as opposed to for utility? Because that, to me, is the big difference between Call of Cthulhu and most other systems' spells, is that Call of Cthulhu spells are not for utility. They are only for story purposes, and they are often extremely negatively affecting everything. My 2 cents on the matter, anyway. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you are new here, please subscribe to my channel and join our Legion. You get new content, a ton of new content every week. Content that I hope is unique from the rest of the role-playing related content out there. There's a lot of Dungeons and Dragons channels and a lot of Call of Cthulhu review channels, but not a ton of Call of Cthulhu keeper advice channels. So I'm hoping that this is something that you might consider joining and helping me out by subscribing to the channel, liking this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. We actually, one last thing, I know this video has been going on forever, but one last thing, we are going to be streaming again very soon, so stay tuned for that. I will make a separate video announcing it very soon, I think. A couple weeks from now. We're figuring out the exact date and time. And it might be all new players, too. So this is going to be interesting. A lot of you guys are going to be playing. This is interesting. Got a lot of requests for me to run games for people, and now I'm finally going to be able to follow through on it. So, thank you for watching. Deathstroke 9, out. See you guys soon.